Very good. Well, welcome all to the Stevenson Center. And once again, I'd like to thank Rosemary for bringing this very important presentation to our awareness, the Stevenson Center's awareness, and helping organize this event. So Rosemary, I'm going to kick it over to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Warwick. And thank you to all of the guests who have come today to this program hosted by the Adlai Stevenson Center on Democracy. We are so appreciative of the Senator and Mrs. Stevenson for allowing us to use your platform for this very important program. The scene in back of me, you probably recognize as a metro station. This is the Lake Cook Metro Station in Deerfield. In March of 2019, as I was waiting for the metro, there were 130 oil cars that went past me that day. So today, our main speaker will be Gerri Songer. She began speaking out at village board meetings in May of 2014 in her hometown after seeing an increased presence of trains at all hours of the day and night and demanded public transparency. Excuse me. Through public records, she learned these trains were transporting toxic, hazardous, and explosive substances, and her research showed that many such trains have met with fiery accidents and created hazardous runoff. Songer is an educator, a local activist, the legislative director of Northwest Suburban Teachers Union Local 1211 of the IFT-AFT, and has been giving this presentation throughout our area to raise awareness. Our second speaker will be Justin Mikulka, who is an investigative journalist for the independent news and research organization DeSmog, and author of the book Bomb Trains: How Industry Greed and Regulatory Failure Put the Public at Risk. For the past 5 years, Justin has reported on the growing threat of explosive oil and ethanol trains in North America. Mikulka holds a degree in environmental engineering from Cornell University and currently lives in New York. And then during the question and answer period, we'll be delighted to add Mark Burrows of Chicago, who is a retired 40-year veteran Canadian Pacific Railroad locomotive engineer who was an active member of SMART TD, formerly United Transportation Union Local 1433, and he served as a delegate for his union's international convention. Since 2011, Mark has been working with Railroad Workers United, an organization formed to bring unity to the voices of the many different unions representing railroad workers in order to fight more effectively for improved safety for railroad workers and the public. He formerly served as organizer and member of the steering committee for this organization and still contributes articles to its quarterly newsletter, The Highball. In his retirement, Mark continues to work to raise awareness among the public about these issues. So we thank all our guests, and I'm going to turn this over to Gerri to start the program.
Thank you, Rosemary. I'm going to share my screen here with you. And I see that we're already getting some questions in the chat, which is great. We're going to save questions until the end of the presentation, only because we have so much to cover. And we did reserve some time for Q&A at the very end. So Rosemary, I'm wondering if you might be able to kind of keep track of some of those questions, and
I'll be happy to
help us with the moderation at the very end. Let me get this started here. So as Rosemary told you, Gerri Songer, I first became aware of this issue back in 2014 when my the trains that had been about 2 to 3 passing my home in 2009 suddenly became about 20, and they were over a mile long. And I started investigating. To me, that just was not normal. And I looked to see what was going on, and what I came across was very disturbing. Before I actually get started, I do want to say some thank yous, of course. I want to thank the Stevenson Center on Democracy, Nancy and Warwick Stevenson, Rosemary, Mark, Michelle Burke, Fritz Edler, Justin, Bruce Campbell, Railroad Workers United, DeSmog, and the citizens of Loch, Quebec, Canada. I'm not going to try to pronounce that because I will definitely do the name of the organization injustice. I'm going to be moving pretty quickly. I'm going to apologize for that ahead of time. As I said, we do have a lot to cover. What I do suggest is if you have a smartphone or if you're able to take screenshots, I encourage you to do that. The slides will have a lot more information and detail that I'm going to be able to go through for the purposes of today. What I'm trying to do today is just give you a basic overview of the issue. If you go to this peoplebeforeprofits.org, you will see that I do have most of this presentation online there, and you can get a little more information if you're interested. These are some other organizations that have done a really good job of covering the issue. So the first thing I learned about when I started my research was about the victims of the Loch Negante, Quebec, Canada incident, and found that very disturbing. These are pictures of 31 of the 47 people who were killed in that one derailment. As you can see, there's young children that were basically burned alive.
You could even see it from space, as NASA's Sumoi NPP satellite took this image of the glow of the fire. People jumped from the third floor of buildings in the central business district to escape the humongous fire. As the blazing oil flowed over to the ground, it entered the town's storm sewage system and emerged as huge fires towering from over storm sewer drains, manholes, and even chimneys and basements of buildings in the area. Around 150 firefighters were deployed to the scene, describing as looking like a war zone.
Oh, monsieur! Oh, monsieur! Oh, my God!
So, number one, this didn't have to happen. Had there been at least better regulation of the industry. And we have something that the victims of this tragedy did not know. We have the knowledge. And I'm about to share some of that with you today. First of all, these freight trains that are carrying this cargo are known as common carriers. They provide services to the general public. The regulatory body may create, interpret, and enforce those regulations with independence and finality. The common carrier needs to demonstrate that it is fit, willing, and able to provide these services, and I would argue that they are in fact not. The ministerial authority is the US government. They have exclusive regulatory authority, and there has not yet been a government mandate made for regulations of industry safety standards. The reason for that is because there are well-financed special interest groups, such as American Petroleum Institute, which has a budget of about $235 million a year, and the Association of American Railroads, which has a budget of $50 to $60 million. Precision railroading. Bill Gates was announced as the largest single shareholder of stock in Canadian National as of 2011. This was once a publicly owned railroad and a publicly financed railroad until it was taken over. CN is the only rail company that has a direct route from oil-rich Western Canada to the refinery-rich Gulf Coast. So Canadian National, the trains pretty much move north to south. And under precision railroading, the focus is on the customer rather than the engineers or the communities where these trains are running through. This gives you an idea of the primary route. And again, these are now privately owned, and Canadian National needs to grant permission for public access to the tracks. Gives you an idea of the secondary routes, what those look like. Another big player in this industry is Warren Buffett, who bought BNSF Railway in 2009. The 6 of the 7 largest rail carriers go through Chicagoland: NS, CSX, BNSF, UP, Canadian Pacific, and Canadian National. Illinois serves 47 common freight carriers, railroads, and 10 private freight carriers. There's 10 major junctions where trains are headed in different directions, and 760 passenger trains pass through our region each day. And that volume of cargo was forecast to increase nearly 150% between 2010 and 2040. There's 5 major corridors all going through Chicago. Chicago is, I believe, the 2nd largest hub in the world. I'm not sure about that, but I know it's in the top number of largest rail hubs in the world, and I believe it's number 1 in this country. So we have a lot of this cargo going through our neighborhoods. In 2006, just to give you an idea of how quickly this has grown, 4,700 trains carried highly explosive crude oil. By 2013, more than 400,000 cars were hauling crude. So that's about an 8,500% increase. Most trains carry about 9 million gallons of explosive crude in trains that are over a mile long, and there is no legal limit to the length of a train. The rail lines were built more than a century ago, and they're not configured for the volume and type of freight that are currently being carried. And in recent years, there have been several major rail projects. The Amtrak Hiawatha proposal, fortunately, has been circumvented along the North Shore. There's also the CREATE program and the Union Pacific Metro West line. I want to give you an idea of how your tax dollars are being used in this industry. Under the CREATE program, sorry about that. Under the CREATE program, there were 70 projects. It is known as a private-public partnership, but the industry definitely has the better side of this partnership. You can see there's about 1.1 billion public tax dollars as compared to 325 million private dollars. And in the business deal, wouldn't that make us a 71% shareholder? Yet we can't even go on the tracks without explicit permission legally. And this is our return on that investment. An explosion resulting from Bakken crude can decimate everything within a 1 mile radius blast zone.
What's increasingly evident is that shale gas is overwhelmingly abundant right here in the USA.
In the last few years, we've discovered the equivalent of 2 Saudi Arabias of oil in the form of natural gas in the United States. Not 1, but 2.
We have twice as much natural gas in this country, is that what you're saying, than they have oil in Saudi Arabia?
I'm trying to very clearly say exactly that.
So, we've had an oil boom here in the United States. This gives you a little idea of where the oil is located. As you can see, it certainly covers a lot of the United States and North American areas, the Canadian areas. And again, if you look at the quick growth of this industry, in 1999, North Dakota's rig count stood at 0, but by 2011, the Bakken oil field was pumping more than 550,000 barrels per day. This is what it looked like when I first started looking into this issue. You can see we were at 7.5 million barrels per day back in 91. That started to decrease. In 08, we were down to, I think it's about 5 million barrels per day. And then as gas prices started to increase, fracking became more viable. And you can see the sudden growth. So this is 2015, and I have a more recent graph. You can see we've continued to go up. We are about 13 million barrels per day now. This is the crude by rail movements. This is 2010. The small thin lines are 1,000 barrels per day. The larger thick lines, which you don't see any of in this particular picture, those would be 8,000 barrels per day. This is 2010, and by 2014, you can see how quickly this increased. And the regulations have not kept up. This is 2010. These are loading facilities. The red is loading, the blue is offloading. 2010, 3 years later, we have, again, the loading is red, offloading blue, and now we have barge in green. This is extraordinarily quick expansion of the industry. This is where oil is processed. This is just an example of one refinery, the ExxonMobil refinery in Joliet, just so you can see, get an idea what those look like. And these are where the refiners are located throughout the country. Most of the oil, the tar sands oil, is going down to the Gulf, and much of the Bakken crude is going to the East Coast. And again, all of that's going through Chicago area. And so we're going to take a look at the local impact. As I had mentioned before, we started in my own neighborhood from 2 to 3 freight trains a day, and then Canadian National merged with the EJ&E Railroad, and in 29, it was up to 20. One of the most controversial issues about this industry was the types of cars used. They were originally made to haul corn syrup, the .111s, and there was a phase out of those. And 2/3 of those tank cars were considered a substantial danger to life by the federal rail safety officials. Most were phased out in 2018, and the remaining should be phased out by 2023. So they are still on the tracks. The next car that they came out with was the CPC 1232s. They were supposed to offer additional puncture and rollover resistance. And there was also a rule that allowed, regarding weight limits, that allowed these tank cars to have a larger capacity, but they were still derailing and exploding. Then came the .117s, and this was the all new car that were safer, but they have met with fiery incidents also. The .117s will be phased in, but they're not the same as pressure cars that are used to move hazardous materials such as liquid propane. Sorry. And in 2018, the first oil train consisting of the .117R derailed in Iowa. 32 cars left the tracks and 14 punctured, resulting in an oil spill of 230,000 gallons into a flooded river. So even the 117s don't offer any substantial benefits over earlier models for surviving derailments intact. And just recently in, I believe this was Washington, they don't have to be going very fast either. The new .117 tank cars derailed at 7 miles per hour. The train derailed, cars ruptured, oil ignited, and the town was evacuated. Tank cars are tested at 14 to 15 miles per hour, but the average derailment speed is 24 miles per hour. Railroads agree to reduce the oil train speeds to 40, but regulators say that the regulators say that they'll consider lowering it to 30 miles per hour, only for trains not equipped with the advanced braking systems. But speeds in excess of 25 miles per hour are considered irresponsible given the known weaknesses of tank cars. Air braking systems, the ones that are currently being used, are from the 1860s, the Civil War era. They do need to be updated. the oil and rail industries say it could cost up to $21 billion to develop and install these brakes, and they claim there'll be minimal benefits. But both Australia and South Africa have introduced these, and they've experienced a reduction in stopping distance ranging from 30 to 70% after switching from the conventional braking systems to electronically controlled pneumatic braking systems. Another issue that you'll see in crude by rail is the vapor pressure, the reed vapor pressure. It can range from 715 PSI. It's explosive, which is why pressure cars are needed for transport. But oil in samples of Loch Negante tank cars range from 9 to 9.6 PSI. And they don't have the pressure cars that they'll use for the gasoline. Oil involved in the massive oil train fire and explosion in Mount Carmel, West Virginia, had RVP of 13.9, and samples from Lynchburg, Virginia were over 14. So Bakken crude falls in the same RVP range as gasoline, but pressure cars are not required for its transport. Stabilization, or you might also hear the term degasification, basically that lowers that vapor pressure, which decreases the combustibility. But the industry argues that there are no studies to support its effectiveness in rail train safety, and it will lower sales by a reported 2%, which I would argue is really what they're concerned about. The industry's answer. So again, these are our taxpayer dollars. The FAST Act transportation bill was a 1,300-page bill that was introduced during the Obama administration. And $11 billion were to be used for, well, potentially used for capital needs like rebuilding bridges and purchasing locomotives and trains. And the bridges, by the way, are also owned by the rail industry. And then there was 199 million that went for positive train control. But much, and then thermal blankets, protective housing around the pressure relief valves. Much of this was undone by the after the Obama administration, during the Trump administration. I did, however, see nicer tank cars than what I had seen prior to that bill. Industry credibility is lacking. Canadian National is well documented for spills of hazardous substances in undisclosed amounts, clearly putting water sources and the environment at risk. They're known for non-disclosure, minimizing, misleading, /lying. There was a really good blog, I think it's Railroaded. Let's see if I can bring this up real quick. And they were keeping really good track of the incidents. And, you know, you can see at least 5 tumbled, undisclosed volume. And they were all the way up to, I think, 50 some pages of this. And then in 2015, I think they figured that was enough proof, and I didn't see them adding any more of the more recent. Yeah, they're up to 54 pages. But
that last document is not being shown to us. We still just see your
okay, well, basically it was just a document showing incident after incident after incident for 54 pages. So that's all you missed. I apologize that isn't working. When I realized what was going past my home, I was very concerned, because right up the track from me, just a few months before, there had been a derailment, and I had my water, or I'm sorry, I had my water tested, and there was methane in it. My daughter, who was pregnant at the time, had drank that water. This caused me, I can't tell you how much anxiety this caused me. I don't know whether that was from the derailment or not. I will never know that, because I never had an opportunity to take a baseline. Also, I did contact the EPA, both the Illinois and US, and I even contacted our county. And I got the same story from all 3 units of government. Well, EPA and the, my county. They refused to investigate unless Canadian National reported spill. So the very industry, the very company that would not want this to be investigated had to be the one to call for an investigation. I find that extraordinarily troubling. So the derailment in Loch, Quebec, Canada killed 47 unsuspecting people. It burned for 3 days. In Cherry Valley, Illinois, there was an explosion and fire that killed a passenger in a car that was stopped at a rail grade crossing. So you don't even just have to be living near this or working near this. You could just be traveling, you know, from one destination to the next, like Zwaila Tali's, 44-year-old woman who died trying to flee a derailment, but she was just stopped at a rail grade crossing. A train derailed, caught on fire, and the Bakken Crude, it will sputter and it releases fireballs, which she could not outrun. She and, you know, her daughter was with her, who was pregnant, and the unborn grandchild died also as they were trying to escape this incident. So this is horrific. What this industry has caused, and the lack of accountability that they still are getting away with. So you don't just have to be near an explosion to be concerned. The cargo that they're carrying is extraordinarily toxic. For example, in Bakken Crude, they have massive volumes of hydrogen sulfides, which are pumped in and used during the fracking. Law prohibits workers from being exposed to more than 50 parts of this. Anything beyond 700 parts per million will result in death within 2 breaths. Enbridge discovered crude within 1,200 parts per million. And exposure to hydrogen sulfide, no matter how seemingly insignificant, can lead to internal organ failure, infertility, immune system suppression, blood disorders, cancer, birth defects, and genetic mutations.
What's the ETA on fire and ambulance?
1222 Effingham, 10-4, Kinmundy-Alma Fire Department advises ETA, 5 minutes, ambulance, 5 to 7 minutes.
2210-4, advise ambulance and EMS to expedite. I'll be out of the car checking victims.
2210-4.
So it's not just the Bakken Crude that you have to be concerned about. This is anhydrous ammonia. I just want you to notice how quickly it takes for this to take effect. I want to warn you ahead of time that this is graphic. So if you have any little ones, you may not want them looking at the computer right now.
1261 Effingham, 1020.
Hey, 1261, I got drop in for 1 just north of Burrows. Ready, hey, ready.
25 with 22 at Dixon Gray Road, with 1053.
And that's it. He's no longer breathing.
Good evening.
There's
in a little more than 48 hours, there have been
gas.
3 railroad tank car accidents in southeastern United States. Before dawn this morning, another derailment in Youngstown, Florida, punctured a tank car, sending chlorine gas into the air and killing at least 8 people. More than 60 people are in the hospital, some of them in critical condition. Kenley Jones reports from Florida.
The train which derailed this time was a southbound freight of the Atlanta and St. Andrews Bay Railroad, a small line which operates between Dothan, Alabama and Panama City, Florida. A tank car carrying poisonous chlorine gas was ruptured in the wreck. A deadly mist of gas spread from the tank car. Motorists who were driving at night alongside the tracks were caught by surprise. Most of the victims who died were found in their cars along U.S. Highway 231.
People killed by poison gas like they were on a battlefield in World War I or something, instead of just driving their car.
Then there's
ethylene
ethylene oxide.
Is an organic compound.
We've had some issues with that in Lake County.
Ethylene oxide possesses several physical and health hazards that merit special attention. It is both flammable and highly reactive. Acute exposures to ethylene oxide gas may result in respiratory irritation and lung injury, headache, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, shortness of breath, and cyanosis. Both human and animal studies show that ethylene oxide is a carcinogen and may cause leukemia and other cancers. Ethylene oxide is also linked to spontaneous abortion, genetic damage, nerve damage, peripheral paralysis, muscle weakness, as well as impaired thinking and memory.
And this is going right through our communities. Again, you don't need a derailed train. All you need is one that's leaking.
An accident involving LNG could be challenging for firefighters because if it ignites, they can't dump water on it. And safety advocates are concerned an explosion could level several blocks or a whole town. Last year, the federal regulations for moving LNG on trains changed. Now the companies don't need special permits anymore, so they can move more of it with greater ease. But the Biden administration could bring back the old rules. And while that would be frustrating for some in the energy industry, it would be welcome news for the citizen groups who have been fighting this fight against what they call bomb trains.
It is a potential bomb for sure.
Fritz Edler is with Railroad Workers United, and the group wants LNG off of trains and far away from workers and passengers. Edler worked for Amtrak for most of his career and now speaks for the union on safety issues. He's particularly concerned that the FEC trains with LNG share the same rails as Brightline, high-speed passenger trains.
There's the specific question of LNG, and then there's the bigger question, the more important question of whether we're running the railroads in a safe way for any product.
For the record, Edler believes LNG isn't safe for the railways under any circumstances. LNG is carried in what are called DOT 113 containers, and trains can have 100 or more of these LNG cars, each with more capacity than what was allowed when the LNG railroad rules were made in 2015. In a federal lawsuit, the group Earth Justice claims 22 loaded LNG tanker cars have the same energy potential as the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. And right now, 15 states are fighting to keep LNG trains out.
As soon as somebody figures out that they can make money doing it, they will do it, and they will route it through your town.
But one of the reasons Edler is sounding the alarm, and it's a big reason, is because he's seen railroad accidents become disasters.
Well, the town of Loch got zero benefit from having that additional risk in their community.
Rulemaking changes say it's open season on every track in the country.
Miho showed us location after location where the tracks pass right by schools and daycares. She and many other opponents are calling for a federal crash study on the LNG tank cars to subject them to collisions at 30 and 50 miles per hour to see how safe they really are. The International Association of Firefighters and the National Association of Fire Marshals oppose LNG on trains.
And FEMSA states that safety is not a pretext for regulation. Well, if safety is not a pretext for regulation, I don't know what is. Fritz Elder also clarified that he doesn't believe it's impossible to move LNG safely. It's just that historically corporations haven't made this a priority over profits, and he doesn't feel that dirty fuels is where we want to be going as a society. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to very quickly show you why this should be a concern to us in this area. I just want to show you some of the areas where these trains are. This is a trailer park on Diamond Lake Road in Mundelein. In Vernon Hills, we've got the elementary schools and middle school. Vernon Hills schools, Lake Zurich High School, right by the football field here. Hawthorne Woods, we've got St. Matthew's Lutheran School. Hawthorne Woods, you can, on a very nice sunny day in summer, you can be boiled alive if there's a derailment near the aquatic center. And here's the playground in Hawthorne Woods, Buffalo Grove right by an ice rink, and Stevenson High School is in the bomb train blast zone. Please note that the yellow is the blast zone. The red is the evacuation zone. So Adlai Stevenson High School is in fact in the bomb zone. If you're within a mile from a railroad track, you're within the bomb zone. In Chicago, there are 77,000 kids at school in that zone, and it's one of the top US cities having school children at risk from spoiled train derailments and explosions. I'm going to just quickly. So what are the odds of us having a derailment here? We've already had 6 derailments in Lake County and Northern Cook County, 2 in Buffalo Grove, 2 in Northbrook at the same location because a bridge wasn't fixed right the first time, and a couple was under the rubble without anybody even knowing they were there until the following day. Another one in Mundelein down the tracks from me, and the latest was in Lake Forest, and that was one of the .111 train cars. And they, Buffalo Grove and Mundelein were not, I didn't find a report filed with the FRA or the NTSB. And the last derailment that I'm going to talk about is the one in East Chicago. 18 cars derailed, 41 cars became disconnected. I'm not going to show, I have a video showing a report on it. Basically, they're talking about how it's making it safer and nobody died. Well, I want you to see what that could have looked like. Here is where the train derailed. Right here is a charter school, and it is right by the refinery. Well, if you widen that, this is that total refinery, and there are more refineries. So what do you think that domino effect could have looked like? And we are in need of more regulation. There is some legislation that has been introduced but not passed. The only one that has passed was in Illinois, but because of preemption, I don't know as it's really going to do much. Oh, that is my very annoying alarm. So my time is up. And I'm just going to finish by saying that I do have the other 2, these have to do with minimum size crews of at least 2. This has been introduced at the federal level by Brad Schneider, Congressman Schneider. But again, they're sitting in committee. And then there was another one that addresses the reed vapor pressure. So I'll stop now. I'm going to put an ask in. Do we have access to a chat? I believe I did see that we did. Rosemary?
There's a question and answer.
Okay. In the Q&A, I'm going to put an ask, basically just to view our People Before Profits page and look at, there is a detailed action plan. And then there is some legislation that I worked with Congressman Brad Schneider's staff. It's all written, it just needs to be introduced. So I'm just gonna ask that you ask that he introduce it. This legislation includes school personnel and emergency response plans specific to the storage and transport of hazardous materials. So again, I want to thank you all so much for the time, and I'm going to pass the torch to Justin.
All right, Gerri, thank you so much. And now I'm going to spotlight Justin Mikulka. And Justin, thank you for coming today, and turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rosemary. And thank you, Gerri, for that great overview. I'll be touching on a lot of those same issues. But the main thing I want to talk about today really is the main topic of how we're facing these risks purely, as Gerri highlighted, and I will go over as well. This is happening because we're putting profits over the safety of the public. And that's indicative of the what I would consider the complete failure of the regulatory system in the US, but also in Canada. As Gerri mentioned, the accident in Loch, that's when we all started learning about the danger of the Bakken crude oil, because that's what was involved in that accident. And that happened in 2013. Just this week, the Wall Street Journal covered a new report that was released by auditors in the Canadian government looking at rail safety and looking how pretty much the reports that came out after Loch pointed the finger at some very lax regulation, really letting the corporations involved do whatever they want. And there were just multiple failures on that level. Here we are almost 8 years later, and what the Wall Street Journal reported based on the auditor's review was nothing has really changed. We've seen no real improvement. The regulators aren't doing a better job. And so that's where we're at, unfortunately, now, nearly 8 years later. And the situation, as you can see from what Gerri highlighted in the US, is not good. It's the same as or worse than Canada. And now we have the issue of LNG by rail being introduced as well. So I think the main issue from a regulatory standpoint is the system is broken and it's not protecting the public. It's working for the corporations. From the standpoint of these bomb trains and these Bakken oil trains and the Canadian oil trains, there's one thing, and that's what I want to focus on today, is if we want to protect the public, there is one issue that we have to address to make that happen. Now, there's a whole host of other things that the rail industry could be doing to make transportation safer for all of those different risks that Gerri highlighted. But if we're talking about Bakken oil and Canadian oil trains, we have to address the oil. So after one of the Gerri mentioned the recent Bakken oil train accident in Washington, in Custer, Washington. She had a photo there of that. And she also touched on a couple of the other factors that derailment highlights. But I think what we can take away from that, which happened on December 23rd last year, was that train was going 7 miles per hour. It was on a straight track. It was a flat track. It was good weather. And it still derailed. It had the new DOT 117 tank cars. They failed, even only going 7 miles per hour. And the oil ignited. And that is what, the key thing we have to focus on is all of these accidents, the real risk is when this oil ignites and we have disasters like we saw in Loch, but we've seen this over and over again with these trains in the past 8 years. So what we need to address is that oil. And that's the key issue that makes these trains into bomb trains. And so in the days following Loch, the disaster there was a lot of confusion in the reporting because the explosions, you saw a video that Gerri showed. I mean, it burned for 3 days. It wiped out the whole downtown. And it was an apocalyptic disaster. And the Wall Street Journal, in their reporting on it in the days after that, they got a quote from an oil executive, which was one of the last honest things anyone from the oil industry has said on this issue. And that executive said, crude oil doesn't explode like that. And so there was a lot of talk about what else could have been involved. They thought the train must have hit propane storage tanks in downtown Loch. They couldn't figure out why. And that is true. Crude oil does not explode. It's hard to ignite. The issue is Bakken crude oil is not just crude oil. It's mixed in with natural gas liquids that come out of the ground when they frack for it in North Dakota. And those natural gas liquids are things like propane and butane. If you've ever used a butane lighter, you know all it takes is a spark to ignite that. That's the issue we're dealing with. That this Bakken oil and also what's coming from Canada is different from crude oil. It's very easy to ignite, and that's why we have these things that we call bomb trains. And so that's the important thing we need to understand is if we want to limit this risk, there are a lot of things we can do. But as the accident in Custer showed us, you can't slow them down anymore. I mean, you'd have to park them to be slower and not have risk of the tanks failing. And when the tanks fail, the oil ignites, because if you crash a train at any speed, there are going to be sparks. You've got a lot of mass there. You got a lot of metal. Metal on metal is going to create a spark, and it ignites. And we know it does because we've seen that over and over in all of these accidents. So to address this risk, the thing to do is we need to be moving. You can move crude oil, as I said, it doesn't explode. But what's being moved is crude oil that's mixed in with other things that are highly volatile. So why are we doing that? And that's what I like to, in my book, I call it the big lie. And it's essentially what the oil industry has been doing ever since Loch. And what they've said is that Bakken oil is no different than crude oil. They've said it poses no greater risk. All of this is easily refuted with the science, or just by looking at any accident where we were told by an oil executive that oil doesn't explode, and yet we see these trains exploding over and over and igniting. So there's a simple way to address this. The oil industry knows how to do it. They do it when they transport oil in pipelines or on ocean-going tankers, and that's something called stabilization. And what that does, it's a process that removes those natural gas liquids from the Bakken oil, which would make it simply crude oil. And as we know, that doesn't explode. So if we wanted to be able to move oil through all these communities and not have the risk of the oil igniting and exploding, then they simply have to use this process known as stabilization. So why won't they do that? And it gets back to the title of this presentation. There have been efforts at the end of the Obama administration, even earlier than that, when they put forth the new regulations to have regulations requiring oil producers to stabilize the oil, lower the vapor pressure by removing the natural gas liquids, and then put it in the tank cars. And the oil industry has fought this every time, and they've won. And again, it is one other area where they have been somewhat honest. There is more than one oil industry person on record saying, if we remove that butane and that propane from the Bakken oil, we stabilize it. So it's no longer this risk of igniting an explosion. It's not worth as much. So we're not doing it. The refineries like the propane and the butane mixed in the Bakken oil. And that's the reality. It's on record. You know, I've detailed all of this in my book, the multiple instances of this. And so basically the argument is, yes, we could make this safer and transport the crude and take away this whole bomb train risk, but it wouldn't make us as much money. So we're not doing it. Unfortunately, because the regulatory system in this country is so broken, they've gotten away with that. Now, the accident in Custer, Washington at the end of last year wasn't surprising that it happened in Washington, because Washington has been one of the constant destinations for Bakken oil since this whole thing started. Washington State has 5 oil refineries, and they found that they can get oil by rail more cheaply, the Bakken oil, than it costs them to get oil from Alaska that they had previously relied on. And so they've replaced a lot of that Alaskan oil with the Bakken oil. So it's working out for the refineries, the Bakken producers, and they're moving this dangerous oil through Washington. The people, activists in Washington have done amazing work over the past 8 years. They've blocked what would have been the biggest oil by rail terminal on the port of Washington, or on the coast of Washington, other projects. So the activists have done a great job of the only way really to protect the public so far in all of this, which has been blocking new infrastructure so they don't have places to drive more trains to unload the oil. So they're very well aware of the risk of this in Washington. There was another train derailment right across the Columbia River in Oregon, right across from Washington. That train was on the way to Washington. That also, again, same scenario of a spill. It ignited, and it was another close call for Mosher, Oregon. But so they're aware of the risk. And aside from blocking the infrastructure, what they did in 2019 is said, all right, if no one else is going to regulate this oil, we're going to say, you want to bring your oil into Washington State, then you have to stabilize it, and you have to reduce the vapor pressure. So we're addressing this risk. It's the same type of proposal that was proposed nationally at the end of the Obama administration that the Trump administration just withdrew. But so that's what Washington State said. We want to protect the public, so you want to bring your oil, you're going to have to stabilize it. The oil industry lobbyists, North Dakota, all got together, fought that. and got the administrators of the Pipeline and Hazardous Material Safety Administration, which is known as PHMSA, that Gerri referenced before. They released essentially, they announced that Washington didn't have the authority to regulate the oil as a state. And that was where Gerri mentioned the quote earlier, but the top lawyer for PHMSA, in explaining that decision, what he said was, safety cannot be a pretext for inhibiting market growth. So they put it right in writing that, that because Washington State was saying our reason for doing this is to protect the public, and yes, it might mean that you have to spend money to and inhibit market growth. What the federal regulators at PHMSA said was, that's no longer an issue. So you cannot use safety as justification for regulation. So that was a big failure. It put the people of Washington at risk. And we then saw an example of that risk when that train going 7 miles per hour derailed. There was the same thing, fire burned for a long time. They had to evacuate the town. They were very lucky that school wasn't in session because there was a school right there. We've seen states try to address this. We know, and you know, I followed this issue for almost 7 years now. This is the key issue. These are bomb trains because of what is being transported. And Washington State tried to address that. The federal regulators said they couldn't do that. It's the regulatory environment and system has always been broken. It got much worse in the past 4 years. Washington State also, along with Illinois and other states, all tried to pass state laws saying you had to have 2-person crews because for safety. They wanted to have 2 people operating these trains. The rail industry fights that quite simply because 2 employees is more expensive than 1 employee. And they say it doesn't make any difference from a safety standpoint. When the Federal Railroad Administration overrode all the state's efforts to have 2-person crews, they said that under the Trump administration, their policy was to remove regulations that were barriers to industry and to let the rail and oil industry volunteer to make safety improvements. So we've been in a deregulatory environment the past 4 years. As you know, as well as them saying, if it cuts into profits, we can't have regulations. So that has been what we've been dealing with. Gerri also mentioned that the modernized brakes, the electronically controlled pneumatic brakes that are one way to improve safety that they're using in Australia and South Africa. There was a regulation. It was the only real thing that came out of the 2015 regulations that would really address the safety of these trains other than dealing with the oil, in my opinion. And that was to put these modern brakes on these trains. The Trump administration withdrew that as well. That was a regulation and they just reversed it in 2017. So we're in a situation, as the Wall Street Journal reported on last week, really things haven't changed in Canada. We've had regulations removed in the US. There have been no safety regulations of any kind to improve safety in rail in the last 4 years in the US. That's the issue we're facing. These trains are still dangerous. The Canadian trains are not carrying Bakken, but they're carrying Canadian tar sands oil that in order to make it, tar sands is a very thick tar-like, it's like asphalt or like peanut butter substance. In order to put that into pipelines, they mix it with something called condensate, which is a very light petroleum product, which is also very flammable and volatile, just like the Bakken oil. And so that's the reason why these Canadian trains pose the same sort of risks. So that's the situation we're at now. As I mentioned, the only thing that's kept us safer, the public in any way, has been activists blocking new infrastructure and the fact that the economics of the oil industry have not been in favor of rail. And so we've been seeing lower volumes nationally and from Canada since the peak of 2015. I want to end on some good news. We do have a new administration. And as Gerri mentioned, one of the things that happened in the last 4 years was the approval of LNG by rail, which is liquefied natural gas, moving in those DOT-113 tank cars. That's a huge risk. She mentioned some of the, putting that in, giving us an idea of the scale of what could happen if an accident with one of those. I recently saw a presentation by PHMSA where they said if one of those trains crashes going 40 miles per hour, even though they have the special DOT-113 tank cars, they expect 4 to 5 of them to rupture. If that happens in a populated area, it will be a disaster that would, I think, dwarf what happened in Loch Negante. So that's a real issue. The good news is right now they don't have those DOT-113 tank cars. So they would have to invest and build them to be able to move large amounts of LNG. So that's one thing protecting the public right now. They haven't done that yet. And the early word out of the Biden administration is they will be reviewing, hopefully taking a look at this LNG by rail regulation that got fast-tracked under the Trump administration. Unfortunately, when you do the regulations the proper way, it could take 2 to 3 years to work through the process of repealing that LNG by rail regulation, which I think is critical. It's insane to allow that. And that's certainly something that we all should be educating our elected officials on to make them aware of that risk. And that repealing that is something that's really critical to protect the public. Other good news, I mentioned the 2-person crew regulation before. And just also this past week, a judge in Washington State, in Washington, again, it's basically a battleground for a lot of these issues, but a judge in Washington State said, essentially, that's ridiculous. Of course, 2-person crews are safer. And so that was a win for rail safety. And that is, unfortunately, the regulatory wins and safety improvements in this country happen when people sue the regulators and force them to do their job. Earth Justice was mentioned earlier, Center for Biological Diversity. There are multiple lawsuits. There are lawsuits challenging the LNG by rail regulation, although those are now on hold, I believe, because they're waiting to see what the Biden administration does. Essentially, the administration has said, let's wait on these lawsuits until we make a decision. So there's good news there on 2-person crews. There's good news that we may be able to get the LNG by rail repealed. And the last bit of good news is the KXL pipeline has been canceled. We are seeing, or you may not be seeing as much of it, but since this is my job and I follow this, I'm seeing lots of letters to the editor across the country, articles saying, you've canceled this pipeline, now they're gonna have to move this oil by rail, and that's riskier. And I certainly agree that if they just take the diluted bitumen out of the pipelines in Alberta, like they have in the past, and load oil trains with that, we've seen that those trains, because of the tar sands is diluted with the very light condensate, when they crash, they catch fire and explode and burn for days, just like the Bakken trains. Railway Age magazine, which is like the leading magazine that covers the rail industry, and is it's rare for them to criticize the rail industry in any way. I don't think they're fans of my work. Even they said that those trains are clear and present danger, as when you're moving this diluted bitumen with the condensate in trains. And we've seen every one that crashes are these horrible spills, large spills, but also fires. The good news is, and this has nothing to do with the failure of the regulators in Canada, who clearly continue to fail. Again, this comes down to profit. The Canadian, the producers in Canada are investing in the technology to, when the oil shows up in Alberta that's already been mixed with the condensate, they are going to pull that out of the condensate out of the tar sands with something called a diluent recovery unit, or a DRU, and get back to that peanut butter asphalt-like substance of just raw bitumen. And so that saves them money. So they're not shipping condensate to the Gulf Coast of the US or wherever in the US these trains are going. But it also means that what's going into these trains, you couldn't set it on fire if you wanted to. And if you crash one of those trains, it's not going to spill. It'd be like crashing a train full of peanut butter. So what we're looking at now is the industry is doing that because it saves them money. And thankfully, it will protect the public. And it also, it would be my preference for them to move oil by rail. I would prefer it go by rail as undiluted or raw bitumen as opposed to being pipelines with diluted bitumen, because we've seen what those pipeline spills can do. Unfortunately, I don't have more good news to sum up, but I do think that is a positive development we're seeing with the risk of the Canadian oil by rail. I guess I will save everything else for the Q&A, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Justin. I really appreciate all your comments and your background. And Mark, if you'll undo your video, I can spotlight you as well. There we go. And this will be our panel to answer the questions for today. I hope you have the speaker view on your Zoom account. So one of the questions that comes up, you've alluded to it, but can you clarify for all of us who exactly controls the regulations for the trains? We have heard, it seems like it's only on the federal level that any changes can be made. Cynthia asked, she said, I contacted a number of communities in Lake County, and the only response is that they have no control, including the ability to inform citizens about the risk or contingency plans in case of derailment. So do the communities, the counties, the states have anything they can do, and what is the actual structure at the federal level?
Well, I'd like to reference SR 982, which is legislation that I drafted, and I worked with Senator Julie Morrison. It was adopted by the Illinois Senate, not this past, well, about a year ago. And this does, it's specific to schools, but it's a resolution that includes school districts in emergency response plans specific to the transport and storage of hazardous materials. Part of that legislation also calls for informing parents. So it is on the books. It is legislation that is currently on the books that is encouraging municipalities and states to get that information out to parents who deserve and have a right to know whether that their children are safe. So, you know, when I first started learning about this, I was told time and time again, there's nothing you can do. This is a federal issue. Well, it is true that the federal government is has ministerial authority, but there is a lot that can be done at the local level in terms of safety, public awareness, and fighting new construction, which, you know, I applaud the North Shore, the people who were involved in circumventing a third rail along the North Shore. They were extremely effective in doing that. So there absolutely 100% there are things that can be done. And I would I'm not sure if you can see my ask, but what I would, being an educator, my biggest horror is having a school blown up. The boards of education, you know, they are the ones who will dictate policy towards the school, you know, towards the administration. And they're the ones that will say, look, you know, part of what we want you to do is to inform school, you know, the parents. So I would start there. And that there's nothing that can be more tyrannical than an irate parent and a concerned parent. So I think if you really want to get the ball rolling, you know, I've been doing my best to get that done, but I am one person in this area. I need help. And so I'm begging you, any of you listening, please contact your school boards and reference SR 982. They're probably not going to know what it is, but you can inform them. I'll put a link in where it says answered on there, and hopefully you guys can see that If not, you can contact, I don't know, Rosemary, if there's, or the Stevenson Center of Democracy, and I can get the information to them too. But that's one place that you can start.
Thank you. Susan McFall brings up the topic of derailments, which we've seen has been the major cause of these explosions. What exactly causes derailments? How can just the safety along the rails? Mark, is this something that you might be able to answer? What causes a train to go off the rails?
Well, there can be many factors, but I'll highlight some of the major ones. Long and heavy trains. These days they are over 2 miles long, 20,000 tons. So the margin for error, there is none. And the dynamics, the physics involved with such a monster like that. So that's one cause, these long and heavy trains. 2, overworked, fatigued crews, working on 10, 12, working nonstop, 12, 13, 14, 15 hours. We don't work 12 hours, more than 12 hours, but we can be waiting to be relieved for 15, 16, 17, and then go back out on rest. But many more and more workers are just simply on the extra board, 24-hour call, going to work on 2 hours notice, relentless. So you have fatigued, overworked crews, and deferred maintenance, speed up. Speed up is a factor in all industries, but in Amazon, when they speed up, you know, you just end up with some crippled workers. But in the rail industry, speed up, more work, less workers. So deferred maintenance on the rolling stock and the infrastructure. So it amazes me to hear about train derailing at 7 miles an hour, and yet there's less and less track inspectors. The tracks are not being inspected as regularly. They're not being maintained as regularly. The carmen who inspect the freight trains before they leave the yard to make sure they're safe for departure, they've been given 20 seconds. They've been given like a time per car, and so if the rolling stock is not in tip-top shape, the wheels don't roll freely. They can end up getting friction and cause derailment. So there's many things can go wrong, but it all comes down to speed up and the relentless quest for profits.
Thank you very much. Evan Craig wants to know, who pays for the damages from these oil train derailments and fires? Are the trains required to have insurance to cover the damages?
Yeah, that's, I think that's an important question. And one of the things I think when these corporations are doing the math on all these events. And so how much does an oil train crashing and blowing up really cost them? And is it something they can easily absorb? What happened in Loch was that railroad had I think $25 million worth of insurance. The estimated last costs I saw, and they still have not rebuilt downtown Loch almost 8 years later. It's still basically a large vacant parking lot where there used to be a thriving downtown. I think the last number I saw was $2 billion. So the insurance, none of the rail companies are required to have insurance anywhere near the level of what could happen and the damage that can be done. There were lawsuits by the families in Loch so there was some payment to the survivors. but a lot of it's going to come back to the public again. And certainly in Canada, what's happening, and the damages, we've seen, unfortunately, just due to the nature of railroads and where they're built and why, they're often along waterways. And so a lot of the oil trains have resulted in oil spilling into waterways and contaminating rivers. Those sort of costs just are not being, the railroads aren't picking up the tab for a lot of that. So there's inadequate insurance, and like a lot of this, it's a phrase, most of my work focuses on the economics of the energy industry. And the phrase I like to use is that they privatize the profits and socialize the losses. So the public, just as we're seeing with the big issue of cleaning up all the fracked and traditional oil and gas wells in the United States, they shift those costs to the public whenever they can.
I want to add that it probably varies municipality to municipality, but the type of insurance that we should be demanding is environmental impairment liability insurance, which is all inclusive. It's very expensive, so they don't want to pay for it. And we should be finding out whether or not it's us paying. And if it is, we should be asking our elected officials to transfer that cost over to the industry that's making a profit from using those rails.
Thank you. I see you've been active on some of the answers, Gerri, but the first one that came in from Howard Serlin wanted to know if oil pipelines are to be eliminated and oil trains are curtailed, how will oil be transported safely? And I told him that the program will answer all these safety implementations that would make it better. Do you have anything to add to that? Except just we're not talking about eliminating trains. We're talking about making the safety improvements.
Well, I love commuter trains, but I don't see it as like an overnight, now you have it, now you don't. I see it as hopefully an aggressive phase out. And I mean, we have our railroad workers that we need to be thinking about. We can be pressing for safety standards in the meantime. And we can be phasing in aggressively alternative energy sources.
Yeah, it's something, the oil industry and their lobbyists and PR people are very good at saying, oh, you don't want pipelines, well then the trains are going to blow up. And then when they want a train project, they say, well, you don't like pipe, they pit the two against each other. It's not a clear choice at all because, as I mentioned earlier, there are no pipelines going from North Dakota to Washington State. So that's how that oil gets. If you want Bakken oil in Washington, you're going to get it by train. And so the industry uses the oil to move, or whatever they can to move it. And it's the great thing about trains. Trains go to ports, and that's what most of the oil being produced. If you're an oil producer in Canada or the U.S. right now, your goal is to get it to the water and sell it to to China or to South Korea. It's exports. That's the game, and rail is very good for that. I would just like to say, what I pointed out earlier, and I've been saying this for years, I could move oil by rail safely, but it's probably not going to be profitable. And so that's the choice they're making. And the number one thing we need to do to make oil by rail safe is stabilize that oil and get back to what that executive from the said in 2013, the executive from the oil industry, crude oil doesn't explode. So we can move crude oil, but if you mix it up with a lot of butane and propane, then you got a real problem. And so the issue is not, can we do this safely? It's, we know how to do it safely. Will regulators force the industry to do that? If they can't do it and make a profit, then don't do it. You shouldn't be able to operate an industry and put the public at risk if you can't do it safely.
Thank you.
I would just like to jump in on that real quickly. And I try to avoid the pipeline versus rail debate on what I like to focus on is just whatever way oil and other commodities are being shipped, transported, produced, that safety has to be the #1 priority. Maximum safety has to be the #1 priority. And we cannot allow it to be at the mercy of various corporations and investors' cost risk benefit analysis. The minute that we concede that they have the right to make those decisions that Justin eloquently refers to, we're at a tremendous disadvantage. Our starting point has to be that we need to agree that to not be subject to these fears, to not be subject to the anxiety of a school being blown up because of a rogue railroad operating unsafely. And so our starting point, you know, we need to demand if this stuff is, if railroads are going to exist, they need to exist safely. And they can be. Yes, it will cut into their profits. And that's a whole nother question, which, you know, raises other issues. But our starting point has to be what we're entitled to. And if we feel that we're entitled to a society that we're not put at risk by rogue corporations damaging the environment, causing potential Loch Negentics, agree that we're entitled to that, and then collectively figure out how to make that happen.
Thank you so much for your eloquence. Robert G. Shaw asks, is rerouting trains a viable option?
Well, unfortunately, they tried to address that in the regulations that happened in 2015. Basically, the way the rail infrastructure is laid out, in some states, the regulation said if you're going through a major population center, you have to slow down. So they had some speed limits, but not below 7 miles per hour. And so that that has a good example of that is what they're trying to do in Loch Negante, which is the people have said, very shortly after that accident and that disaster. And like I said, I've been there. The downtown is it's gravel where there used to be a whole downtown. They built the train track right back there. And so trains have been running through Loch Negante ever since. And the people there understandably want the train moved around their town. 8 years later, it's still being discussed. The government says they're open to doing it. But so when is that going to happen? 15 years after the accident for one small town. So rerouting, the industry's not going to do it, and it really just isn't feasible, and which is why we have to address the safety of what we're moving, because they're going directly through, this is a huge issue for Chicago. It's a rail, you're seeing the worst of it, so.
Thank you. Dan Conley wants to know, are executives indemnified from criminal prosecution for willful negligence? I guess if there are no regulations, you can't be negligent.
Well, essentially, yes. What happened in Loch Negante was they blamed the guy, the train operator, and 2 other low-level employees. Meanwhile, in my work, and other people documented it, right after Loch Negante, a columnist in Canada said, he referred to it as a corporate crime scene. And I think that's very accurate, because there were so many things that went wrong, and it was all cost cutting and avoiding regulation that led to that accident in Loch Negante. So were the executives held responsible? No, and they never have been. And so that's one of the other issues. It's an issue actually focused in some of my current work. We don't really prosecute white collar crime anymore in this country. So CEOs don't go to jail, and and they're not paying fines. And so that's a big problem. And they get greatly rewarded, and they get huge bonuses if they cut corners and make profits, and they don't pay the consequences when things go wrong.
Thank you.
I would just like to jump in real quickly. My answer to that is they're not officially, CEOs and corporate execs are not officially, there's nothing written in stone, that they're not, but for all intents and purposes, as Justin said, they are. But I would add that Bruce Campbell's book lays out the case for all any prosecutor would need is Bruce Campbell's book, and you could get a conviction on some kind of negligent manslaughter, and the only reason that doesn't happen is just simply because of lack of political will. But the facts are there, and if Bruce Campbell were a prosecuting attorney, it'd be a slam dunk. I'll just leave it at that.
All right, and let's finish up. So if we write to our congressmen, so whether it's Brad Schneider or Jan Schakowsky or whoever's district we're in, Congress, correct, has oversight over the federal, and what is the federal agency again that makes the rules? And how potent is Congress in controlling the agency? And what about Pete Buttigieg now that he's been appointed for head of the transportation? Who are we asking to do this?
So Buttigieg is the new Secretary of the Department of Transportation. He is ultimately the top person overseeing this. Underneath the DOT is the Federal Railroad Administration, often referred to as the FRA. Underneath that is PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials and Safety Administration. So the way it works is PHMSA is the one who come up with the regulations with input, working with technical people with FRA, but the ultimate decision, well, not the ultimate decision. The DOT and Secretary Buttigieg are the ones who need to be pushing for this. And so those are that's who should be being pressured. Unfortunately, the regulations are not finalized by the DOT. What happens is they go to a group which is known as OIRA, which is under OMB, which if you saw in the news this week, Neera Tanden was trying to be appointed as the head of OMB. Before regulations are finalized, they go to OMB, and that actually, there were supposed to be regulations to address the volatility of the Bakken oil in 2015. The Secretary of Transportation at the time, Secretary Anthony Fox, wanted that because, as I've explained and as we all know, if you do that, we're gonna take this risk away. That died in OMB, so that's the final stage, and that's a private. The public doesn't have any. That's where executives from BNSF and Exxon and the oil companies and the train companies meet privately with people at OMB and argue their case, and they won. So Congress also has a very important role, though. The way that the regulation was put in place for modernized braking systems on oil trains, that happened in 2015. That was removed by the lobbyists going to Congress and saying, we don't want this. And Congress saying, well, let's study it. So here's some money to study it. And if the study says this doesn't make sense, then we're going to remove it. They did that. I've written extensively about that in my book, articles that are all available on DSMOG. It's a completely flawed process. The study was bogus, but that's Congress's role. And I'm sure you are aware of the influence of the oil and rail industry over Congress. So how broken the system is and how much control the corporations have over it really was evidenced by that regulation for modernized braking systems. That passed. That was something that was going to be the law of what they had to do. I was at a conference in Washington, D.C. shortly after it passed, several hundred people in the room, and the CEO of BNSF was being interviewed on stage and was asked about the new regulation for the modernized braking systems. He said, we don't like it, we're going to get rid of it. And they did. And so he had no problem just stating that in public. And the way they do it is by going through Congress. And so it's very important to educate your congressional representatives on the risks of LNG by rail, on the risks of oil by rail. And they're the ones who need to be pushing this. So it goes through the regulatory process of the DOT, but Congress plays a critical role.
Thank you so much. And Warwick is going to close us out and tell us about the next program from the Stevenson Center. Oh, you're muted, Warwick.
Thank you, Rosemary. And once again, thank you for your help today. I believe the presentation we've just seen is a great example of grassroots activism and regular people doing the research and the outreach on a very, very important topic. So thank you, Gerri Songer, Justin Mikulka, Mark Burrows, Rosemary. Thank you very much for bringing this to our attention. It's the belief of the Stevenson Center that facts and information can empower citizens, and that the empowered citizens is key to good government. So we hope that everyone that has participated today will get out and make a difference to try to bring a successful resolution to this issue.